shit.
Here, I've got you. Give me your hand.
Just go!
The Uncharted series was really one of the main reasons to purchase a PlayStation 3 over the Xbox 360, and in terms of the exclusives for the console, it definitely stood amongst the best of them. Developed by video game veterans Naughty Dog, it was a series where you took on the role of wisecracking, globe-trotting Nathan Drake, a treasure hunter with a penchant for one-liners and a godly amount of upper body strength. These games were the closest you'd ever get to a modern iteration of Indiana Jones in video game format, and I think you'd have to be really jaded or just an Xbox fanboy to not have found these games immensely enjoyable. Not only did they really take scripted action sequences to the next level, but they also added a much greater focus on the human element, creating some genuinely emotional and believable cinematics through great use of voice acting and motion capture.
Yeah, hello.
They're hands down some of the best games for the PlayStation 3 and also hands down some of the best games for the 7th generation of consoles. Now with the release of Uncharted 4, the series has again been revived for the PlayStation 4, and again critics have had nothing but glowing things to say about it. I had no intention of doing an Uncharted 4 review, but after having seen nothing but overwhelmingly positive reviews for the game, I felt I had no choice. I'm sure most people have already picked up and finished the game by now, but for those folks who haven't spent their hard-earned dough on it, there's a few things I think are worth mentioning, if not just for posterity. I want to start off by saying that I don't consider this a bad game in the slightest. It is visually stunning, the scripted sequences are amazing, and it has a pretty decent story. It's great to see familiar characters returning, or at the very least hear them mentioned in cinematics, and you've got to give kudos to Nolan North for again bringing Nathan Drake to life. Some of the cinematics are more emotional and well written than what you'll find in big budget Hollywood movies, and the sheer size of some of the set pieces again trumps that from even the biggest summer blockbusters. Also, we're going to be talking solely about the single player campaign. I've never been a huge fan of the multiplayer, and I won't insult the community by giving my uninformed opinion on it. The main issue I have with this game is that it just didn't really ever need to be made in the first place. The ending of Uncharted 3 pretty much left everything wrapped up in a neat little package. Nate was reunited with Elena after a rocky period. They tried to explore a pseudo father and son relationship with Victor Sullivan that was mostly hit and miss, and we got a bit of a look at Nate when he was a lot younger, which helped develop him as a character. The main cast literally walked off into the sunset during the ending cinematics, so why they chose to bring everyone back for a fourth round is just beyond me. In Uncharted 4, Nate has given up his adventuring days and settled into a so-called normal life with Elena. He works for a salvage crew and sits around doing paperwork and filing things away in his attic. Did you ever think you'd see Nathan Drake doing paperwork in an Uncharted game? Anyway, the return of his supposedly deceased brother Sam, voiced by Troy Baker, requires him to chase after a long-lost pirate treasure to pay off some bad debt, which throws him back into the fray alongside Sully, up against new antagonists Rafe and Nadine.
I'm not in the mood for games.
Their new goal is to find the long-lost treasure of the famed pirate Henry Avery and Thomas too, which leads them all around the globe before they end up on the typical tropical island for the game's final act. And this brings us on to the main issue with the game, and that's the development of the characters and the narrative. Now, the previous games in this series were all written by Amy Hennig, and they managed a good balance of cinematics to gameplay. Uncharted 4 has been written by Neil Druckmann, who wrote The Last of Us, and if you've ever played that game, you'll know how dialogue intense it was, and just how lengthy and drawn out some of the cinematics could be. And it seems they've kind of brought that approach across to the new Uncharted. I mean, the first couple hours or so of the game has an absolutely horrid pace, with really nothing happening the entire time. There's a few sequences where you're in control and get to jump around and do a bit of exploration, as well as a few short shootouts, but by and large, very little happens. Now, you'd kind of expect, and I guess really justify this by saying that they're just establishing the characters, except this pace is really kept up for the entire game. I'll admit that the other games are guilty of this to an extent. Uncharted 2 starts off with that horrible museum heist, and Uncharted 3 has that really long and boring trudge through the London sewers. But once the action picks up, it never really stopped, but this can't be said about Uncharted 4. Generally, the pacing of most chapters goes that you start off by walking around for a bit, doing a bit of climbing, solving a puzzle or two before you get a 5 or so minute shootout. Then you move on to the next chapter and you do it all over again. Towards the end of the game, there's a series of shootouts that goes for maybe 20 to 30 minutes, but then after that it switches gears again and slows right back down. Areas like Madagascar put you in a jeep and let you drive around for a bit, taking part in the occasional gunfight as you explore the surroundings, but it's still overshadowed by the multitude of slower paced moments. It's like if you can remember back to Uncharted 2, there's that long section where you're going through the series of caves with the Sherpa, climbing for what seems like a goddamn eternity, but at that point it was a welcome shift in the gameplay. Because prior to this, you just had a shootout in a village before the long couple of chapters where you're on that moving train, before another shootout in a blizzard where you were getting pummeled from all angles. After you've had such a barrage of combat areas, being able to scale things back was a welcome addition, but in Uncharted 4, right when the action gets to the point where it really kicks off, it all just comes to an end. And you're going back to walking around and climbing another series of cliffsides, listening to characters banter back and forth in between. Now, it shouldn't matter all that much because these sections are quite polished, except the majority of platforming is almost unfailable, and the only time you'll die during these moments is because of a momentary lapse of judgment. The game's never too crushing that you'll be stuck on a certain section like you're playing an actual platforming game. Even the puzzles will be solved really quickly, and if they're not, the game will literally tell you what the solution is. Even Uncharted 3, which people often regard as the weakest in the series, had that really long sequence of events where you're in that ship graveyard shooting pirates before you're on a large cruise ship that you barely end up escaping before it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. The games have always had a good balance of combat and cinematics, but like I said, I feel they've just got this ratio backwards this time. It's not a walking simulator, it's a climbing simulator. It just doesn't feel like a proper Uncharted game at times. I mean, even the music feels like it's lacking. Greg Edmondson composed for the other games and sadly not this one, and you can really tell. The main menu is even missing Nate's iconic theme. You know, that assault of brass and percussion that had you bursting at the seams ready to kick all kinds of ass. Yeah, it's gone. I'm not saying the cinematics are bad. Like I said, the level of polish with the animations and voice acting is superb, but the length of them needs to be offset by actual gameplay, which it mostly isn't. Then there's the combat in general. Now, this has had a few minor modifications of its own. For starters, it seems they've taken another page out of The Last of Us and given the player the option of taking a stealthier approach to taking out enemies. You can even pass entire sections without having to fire a single shot, though sometimes they'll force you into it before you can leave the area. In certain areas, you're able to hide in clumps of tall grass and take someone out quickly without giving your position away. Even if you are seen and combat is initiated, you can easily run away, lose their line of sight and go back to hiding in the bushes. The shooting is still challenging stuff, and making use of cover is essential, a lot of which is now destructible, which means you can't just set up camp behind something and keep taking shots until everyone's dead. The inclusion of a rope also means you can swing back and forth across ledges quite quickly, which is used primarily during the climbing sections, but can also be used pretty effectively during combat. Some of the sections where you're using the rope for platforming is asshole puckering stuff. It's dizzying when you're swinging across these large ravines and leaping these impossible distances to grab onto small ledges. They're neat additions and well thought out, which surprises me on the flip side then as to why they've removed other mechanics like the melee counterattack and the option to throw back enemy grenades. In Uncharted, the melee combat has always been pure button mashing, but the only thing making it somewhat less tedious was the ability to hit triangle and initiate a counterattack, often turning the tide of a fight. In Uncharted 4, they've done away with this, and all I can say is, why? Maybe it's because Nate is older now or something and not as good of a fighter anymore, but he can still leap across ledges and stay perched on the edge of something indefinitely with his infinite grip strength, so who knows. Also, with throwing back grenades, this could often be a way of turning the shift of a gunfight in your favour really quickly, and it also felt very rewarding if you got the timing of it right, as it could take out a cluster of bad guys in a single throw. Again, why they've removed this is beyond me. It also seems like you need to be closer to something now before Nate will snap to it for cover, which had me frantically kind of mashing the circle button during a gunfight. And also on that note, it still bugs me that the button to take cover is the same button to dodge roll. You know what happens as a result? Yeah, sometimes you'll take cover when you're trying to dodge roll and vice versa. This has been the same since the first game, and it's often caused issues during some of the more frantic gunfights. The problem with the Uncharted games is that when it comes to people reviewing them, you're either getting people giving them perfect scores like 10s out of 10, or really jaded people who flat out hate the game for personal reasons and give it a 0. If you don't believe me, go check out the user scores on Metacritic. The amount of people giving the game a rational analysis are outnumbered by those in either extreme. Again, I have to stress, Uncharted 4 isn't bad by any means, but like I said, I think it's a game that never really needed to be made, and it often seems to forget some of the aspects that made the other games so much fun. The whole central focus on the development of characters that have already been suitably developed over the past 3 games often overtakes the game's action sequences. and it leaves the whole thing feeling schizophrenic. I don't think it deserves the negativity it got from the Washington Post, not by a long shot, but it's definitely not a game that doesn't deserve scrutiny. And people should really do their research on this one before just jumping on the bandwagon and hailing it as the masterpiece it's being made out to be.
Holy shit. Yeah,